time. We'll see whether that's a good idea. Okay, it's now recording to the cloud. Cool. Do we want to just kind of take a look at this agenda and talk about the stuff that we put there? So I think the most exciting is the impending research collaboration with Block Science, for which we're already seeing some fruits in the form of Z's work on the research repo. Yeah, Z, is there anything you want to say about that?
I mean, besides that, I'm really enthusiastic, and I think right now I'm putting some effort into the resourcing side. Like David, who actually I invited to come to this call, but he had other commitments today, maybe future ones he can join, has been working on the sort of design and documentation side. I've got a work session with him tomorrow. And then on the sort of data scientist side, obviously you and I have both started off playing with the sort of inspection notebooks and kind of want to extend that into sort of full-blown exploratory data analysis in a relative short term. And I think that's going to sort of motivate the convergence between the sort of research layer and the implementation layer, because as we discussed, sort of making sure those things match up nicely is an important part of getting that what I'll call a research environment set so that people can participate in research, obviously not just us, and have some strong sense of sort of consistency with implementability, right? That one of the big breakdown points can be that if research goes off on a tangent too far, you might come up with cool stuff and have it be, not relevant to the actual project. So yeah, so I think in particular, I'm enthusiastic about over the next couple weeks as we lead into launching the collaboration, that the effort focuses a little bit more on both sort of setup and people. And yeah, so that's where I'm at.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really excited to start. I think just like having this, having a Python notebook that contains the source code graph makes it so much easier to just start like kind of hacking on things and asking questions like, how does the node count vary or how does the degree vary by the node type? We have this little chart here. Maybe I'll screen share just for anyone who hasn't seen this notebook yet.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Like when I saw both that you conformed it to the multi-digraph and then that you started playing around with it, it made me really happy.
Yeah, so we have here like, this is for the source code repository. So we can see like the node count by type. We can see the edge count by type. We can see the degree by type, and this is on a log scale. So, the repo has orders of magnitude more connections than anything else than users, and then like comments and reviews are comparatively disconnected. And I've long had this hypothesis that you could build a model that would approximate the current algorithm reasonably well, that just assigns a fixed score to every type of node that you author. And then, you get a score based on your number of polls, a number of issues, a number of comments. Obviously, such a model should not work in principle, or like we don't want the algorithm to be that model, but I have this null hypothesis, call it, that the model would actually approximate the output pretty well right now.
So can I actually make a comment on that? And I think it goes to metrics and graph metrics. So part of the reason why the exploratory data analysis makes sense and we start to understand the structure of these graphs is that we're going to want to create sort of synthetic graphs that we generate to ask and answer questions. So one of the things that one could do would ask whether the algorithm approximates that under certain conditions. So in a graph like the one that we have today, the algorithm might look like that. And that might actually be a desirable property when we say, for a graph like this, it should seem like this. But then, in a sense, for a graph like something else, potentially something synthetic that we generate as a sort of rich interconnection of repos, we would expect that to go away. You see what I mean?
Totally. And I think it may well be, like, if we were to generate some, I think it'd be interesting to generate some like attack graphs, where we sort of like take the source code graph and then we simulate a new agent who comes and just like adds one comment to every issue. And we should start, it'll be cool to be able to start iterating on like systems like that to see what happens and how we can prevent that perfectly.
And I don't know the extent to which you guys, other guys on the call have familiarity with the sort of Python notebook style work, but the kind of thing that you can do with NetworkX, which is the tool that we're using here, is you can write sort of little graph generator models. And in fact, it's going to be graph generators through which we model human behavior, right? So we're going to be able to add or remove nodes and edges through that tool and essentially simulate, both static and dynamic conditions. Static would be generate a graph and then see how it scores. Dynamic would be to sort of frame it as a network formation game with a current state of the network G, and then you can use the operators that add or remove nodes or edges to represent activity. And so we would be able to sort of eventually do kind of not just static attack analysis where we say what would happen if you add a like or a comment to everything, but rather something where someone does something and then looks at the way that their score changed and then does something else and then looks at the way that their score changes and then does something else, which is actually kind of what we should expect from I would say actors, but I think we're gonna have to level up to that. We're gonna have to do a lot before we're running that kind of test. And I will apologize for that cluster of nodes. I was basically poking around with the plotting, and unfortunately the methods that I normally use, the graph was so big that the force sort of weighted algorithms weren't converging fast enough, and the spectral one was basically collapsing because the graph just isn't that rich yet, so it collapsed to not much. And so I was playing around with different ways to randomly spread them out because even just the random method made a big cube of red. But I think as we inspect the data, we'll be able to make up little heuristics for organizing things, and we'll actually be able to see meaningful plots. And actually, as we introduce the graph metadata, we can color the nodes by their type. And I just, this was my first hack at playing around with it, and so I feel a little guilty that didn't get deleted.
That's fun. So I think the high level takeaway for me here is that the kinds of work you do are constrained by the kinds of tools that you're using, and so forth. We've been using the tools of like really robust tested production software, which has been nice for building the system. But mixing the Python notebook sort of fast exploratory tool into the mix, I think will let us get like a lot more results in like the research and experimental direction, and that's pretty exciting.
I have a quick question for you, Z. I don't want to sound like I'm shilling for my glorious employer, but have you used Colab?
What was that?
Have you used Colab, Google Colab?
I had one team member that really pushed for it, and we used it a little bit, but it didn't really get adopted. So my experience was like, I used it just little enough to be frustrated with it and not long enough to figure it out well enough to give a fair assessment of it.
Cool. I guess I should ask more generally, like, do you use notebooks a lot, and what's your like collaborative notebook workflow?
Right. So I do use notebooks a lot, and actually I was discussing this with Dandelion before. What I find is that most people work on their own notebooks, and they results are if you collaborate, you kind of grab code from each other, but you don't necessarily grab the same notebook because it's not really production software. Reality is that your notebook is kind of your own scratch work, and then I don't expect notebooks in general to leave people's individual branches unless you're actually working together to construct something I would call a publication. It doesn't have to be a full-blown paper, but you make it a set of experiments where you put the markdown to explain what you're doing, and you make sure that the data sort, like you connect something up that's meant to be a reproducible experiment, and then you push that, and those are collaborated on a little bit more like a code, but even then it's still a lot of copy paste from other notebooks, agree, and then use basically GitHub as the control mechanism.
Cool. Yep, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, what we were talking about, this is kind of another item I put on the agenda, was like kind of the code management in the SourceCred/research repository. So I think what Z and I have talked about is the idea that research and experimentation will mostly happen on individual branches, like Z just said. I'm thinking that before too long we'll have an infra subdirectory, and that infra subdirectory will be like the more tested, more production-y code that other stuff depends on. And so I'm thinking that the little function that I wrote that converts a SourceCred graph into a NetworkX graph is the kind of thing that would go into infra. I'd also like to get a conformant implementation of our PageRank algorithm in Python. that just does the same thing. So we can use that as our baseline for future, like, for comparing it to alternative approaches. So I think that there'll be some stuff that gets like more thoroughly code reviewed and gets merged to master. And then there will be a lot of stuff just floating in people's individual branches.
I suspect two things. One is that the infra directory is going to end up being essentially a wide set of utilities ranging from graph generators to the validation tests that we want to run repeatedly. And in particular, you mentioned the implementation of basically a canonical PageRank implementation, which I view as being an important piece of the infrastructure precisely because it should be the benchmark. So you should almost, like as quickly as possible, obviously we have a lot to figure out. We want to get that implementation not just written, but we also want to write some basic sort of validation scripts that you can run that will compare any particular thing that you might implement to that in some meaningful way. And that kind of brings us to the biggest open question that I think is tricky, which is what are the validation metrics? And my intuition on this and experience on this is that we will start with some very simple things like how does score correlate to degree and work our way up to things that are more meaningful. But because there's not really a right or wrong answer and what we're doing is merging our technical proficiency with our intuition iteratively, the eventual metrics that we say are the metrics are actually probably going to come quite a ways downstream, where early in the process we are trying metrics out and seeing whether or not we find them to be good encodings of the things that we care about. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I think this is pretty conformant with my own like desire for a while that we should create little like example sort of canonical test cases where we know very clearly how the cred should flow. And we can start with like really simple ones and then add on more and more complicated test cases. And we can use this to start to build like a battery of tests where on we can try a new metric and just see how well it did in all of our little toy cases.
So you know what's funny? I was brainstorming on that the other day and I came up with a simple example of a line graph. And I found myself wondering whether or not even just whether or not we wanted the line graph to accrue value at the root, or whether it should be distributed evenly, or whether it would accrue, like even something as simple as that, you're like, it's not immediately clear what the right distribution of cred would be for a line graph.
I posit it should be evenly distributed across the line. I wonder if
and that's fine. Actually, that crossed my mind. But the point was like just the fact that we have to think about it, I think underscores the fact that the metrics are kind of to be determined, because you pose that test case and still say, well, it's a subjective thing whether or not it should be at the head, the tail, or even. I actually kind of agree with you. I think that would be a cool test case for us to say that, line graphs should be viewed as being, a reference case, and the more evenly distributed the algorithm is on line graphs, then maybe the more balanced the algorithm is.
Yeah, alternatively, I feel like you could make a case that, and what will happen right now is that the cred will probably accumulate in the middle of the graph, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I think that this is a great direction to go down of just like coming up with a bunch of these example cases and documenting what we think should happen on them, and then using those as test cases.
And we can evolve. What's so tricky about this is I think that we're going to eventually find ourselves changing our minds about what we think should happen, which is part of the reason why there's two layers here. One is the test cases themselves, and the other is what we actually want to happen under those test cases.
Right. Yeah, it'd be cool. We should spend some time thinking maybe like offline about how we can make those test cases like easy to grok what they are, easy to like visualize, easy to add to, so that other people can come and like provide their own intuitions and come up with new test cases.
And this is going to come from canonical graph generator models, just for the record. So the reason that these are going to be grokkable, and the reason why I directed you guys at NetworkX, is because it actually has a variety of network generators built into it that are related to canonical graph structures that have implied properties, and they are related to certain types of processes. So although there's a little bit of a learning curve, you can make decisions like, say, you write a generator that is a reasonable version of what's the name of I forget. Like, it's just basically a winner take all, where like the more popular something gets, the more popular it gets. There's a name for the graph generator model, but the point is you could create a version of that, and then you could say, how does it scale in that graph, or like how does it spread out as that graph scales. And you could ask that question, and it's a repeatable scientific experiment defined against a generator model that has a lot of literature, so that when it comes to like asking and answering questions, you kind of have a one parameter sweep where you're saying scale, you have a distribution of the cred, and you have a sufficiently structured question that the results are interpretable. That's the kind of thing that I imagine. It's just that it takes time to build those reference cases, because they shouldn't just be because I have a reference case. They should be because I have a reference case that fits with something that makes sense for source cred. Sorry if that was a lot. We can.
Yeah, so maybe there's a couple other things I want to make sure we reach on this agenda. So maybe we can move to one of them, if that's all right. Specifically, so the logos. I'd really love to talk to you guys about logos, and I'm going to share screen again. So we have a whole like lineage of logo proposals, and they're all here in the source code repository. I think at this point we have enough good proposals that we should choose one, and then we can always choose one and then continue to like find variations or improve on it in the future. But I think right now we're still with our circle with 4 spokes, and I think we've got some cooler stuff from that. So I will just kind of walk you guys through the history of source code logo designs, and then I would love to hear some feedback, and let's aim to just make a decision. So we started with this symbol, and there's a whole bunch of context here, which is that basically William and I were trying to choose a Unicode symbol that would represent cred, kind of like how every currency has its own symbol. And we found that there's this symbol which means like alternative or unknown currency. And you're like, oh, that seems kind of cool. So we just use that as a placeholder. Now then I kind of felt like source cred, it's kind of got this like ecosystem of open source vibe. I kind of like the metaphor of it shining light on projects to like help them grow, help like reward the things by like, drawing attention to them. And so my partner LB kind of doodled a bunch of little like nature themed logo concepts. We have this like eye with like a sort of a ray of sunlight and a leaf. We have this like sprout growing in front of a sun, maybe some like dandelion seed kind of ideas. And I was personally pretty attached to this one. It's kind of like a leaf with like the sun with like another like sprout in front of it. And our wonderful logo designer Agata at Protocol Labs went and created a bunch of logos based on these concepts, such as like this one here, which is sort of the like sprout and sun motif. Also a bunch of dandelion themed logos. And these are pretty cool because they get the like sort of graph interconnection like network thing that's going on with source cred. Then I had some more commentary here. I was kind of saying I do really like these ones. This is probably my favorite personally. These graph ones are cool. And then William said that he thought this like was really drawn to the eye kind of sun leaf motif. And then I guess I came up with another round of logo designs that are kind of more. And this is LB who created the original sketches, although they won't be able to hear you because it's all coming through my headphones. And then we had this sort of set of more like kind of nature and themed source code logos. And some of these are incorporating like sun and sprout kind of motifs as well. And also another doodle of the one that William liked a lot. Yeah, and I feel like a little bit like, oh no, now I have so many good choices. But at the end of the day, it's not about having a whole bevy of choices for logos. It's about choosing a logo. So maybe with your help, we can choose one of these.
Let the bike
Also,
shedding begin.
yeah, let the bike shedding begin. I can put, oh, actually, Brian already put this link in the Discord. So if you want to have the freedom to just like look over the logos yourself. Yeah, what do y'all think? What are your favorites?
So which channel in Discord is it in? I haven't seen these before, so I want to look at them a little bit more.
It's in general. I can PM it to you.
Okay, cool.
Just glancing at them, I like the very top one on the last post.
The very symmetrical one with the sun and the.
It strikes me that it's the least detailed one. There's value in it being sort of glanceable if it's a logo. People aren't going to like look at it for a long time to like grasp its meaning. So that one sort of conveys growth to me, which is
I like the conveying growth idea. I think I'm sort of picking through them, looking for one that sort of captures both the growth and the sort of graphiness, which to me is some of the ones that are leafy, where you have like the growth, but they're not just like two sprouts, but like something that's got a little bit of texture to it. So it's growing like a, like a tree of repos and whatnots. Like I'm still kind of looking through to see which one fits that. But that's sort of, when I saw the presentation, I was thinking like, I was thinking about growth, but then just sort of the growth in a sort of graphy sense.
Among the ones in that category, let me see if I can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 from the top of the last post stands out to me. It's kind of like it has a loop that goes up, and the loop is not connected to the main stem. I don't know. Looks good to me.
If I share my screen, I'll show you, like, I've highlighted the like 4 or 5 to several of them that are in that category, and I'm pretty happy with, I'm actually pretty happy with anything, but if I were to go, I'm really bad at this. How do I share the particular, it's on a different panel, that's why. Zoom, sorry. This happens to me every time.
I've had so many problems sharing screen with Zoom. I totally empathize with you. Multiple times have I disrupted meetings by getting my computer into a state where I can't unshare the black screen that I'm sharing, and then I reset everything.
I use a Mac, and so then I'm finding myself struggling to put them on the same, like in the same world, so that now if I go to, that's the wrong one. Great, now I have to find the page. Here we go. I did it. So I was looking at essentially this block was the ones that jumped out at me for the reason that I just said, the sort of graph growing sense, but that's not like by any means, I don't know, better than the other ones, just the ones that fit with what the description I just gave. Anyway. I don't know. I also really like the one William likes. I have the feeling that I'm the least helpful person because my answer is just like, wow, that's really cool. Like this is really cool. It's the most different from all the other ones though.
Yeah, it is really cool. It definitely like stands out. It's got it's a very like distinct impression. Yeah,
I definitely still like that one.
It has the leitmotif also.
Yeah, it does. I still feel that there's something about the drawing that LB drew that the logo does not capture for me. And I don't know how to rectify that, so I don't know.
Do you want to scroll up, Azzy, to the drawing that inspired that one? Yeah.
I have a question for you. What if you closed the loop so that it was like a seed and it was growing? So like, what if the right edge curled on the circle over onto the top of it? I know that's like an additional suggestion, but it jumps out at me as bridging between this one and the others, because all of the other ones, they sort of feel like they're anyway, the point is there's something in my brain that's interpolating between this and everything else that I'm seeing, and it just wants to curl this over into the seed.
That's an interesting idea because sprouts do unfold in this kind of like circular pattern sometimes, right? I feel like that's definitely something that I've seen. Yeah, I mean, the good news is that for this one, I have the original artist, like, a couple feet away. So I can definitely ask them to explore that concept.
I know you wanted to make a decision though, so the suggestion of something else is not particularly helpful. I'm just like, my brain is like really drawn to the one that William likes, but I think that in order for it to like fit with everything else we discussed, that's what would bridge the gap.
Yeah, I don't necessarily need like, I guess I do want a decision, but I'm willing to have that decision be that we're going to want something like this flavor, but we're still like maybe have a couple more tweaks to make to it. I just don't want us to be like stuck in this like decision paralysis where we just haven't chosen a logo. Yeah, what do you think of this one, Brian? Of this this design?
I do, like I said, like the spotlight metaphor works for me.
Yeah, I was showing the logos to somebody, just like somebody who I just was telling SourceCred about a couple, I guess last week or so. And the one, Brian, that you liked, they said something like, this one I like too, although I kind of feel like it could also be a grocery store. And I feel like it's a benefit to this logo with like kind of the eye, sun, leaf metaphor is that it's very specific to like looking at things, shining a light on things, like growing things. It's cool. Yeah. LD. The thing we're now asking about is whether we could take this one, but kind of connect this into here. So it's kind of like a seed that's like growing out, and this is like the whole plant, but it's also like emanating a ray of light.
Oh, interesting. I like that. Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. Sounds like we can commission an exploration of that concept.
But I want my source cred.
Okay, so you know what? Since let's say that this is we've made good progress on the logo issue. We've introduced it. We'll get another design, and then we'll really decide next office hours. Man. So the other thing we have on the agenda is this really cool hackathon that Z dropped into our laps. Z, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So, again, the nuts and bolts of it is I was planning to go to this big, huge hackathon in the Netherlands that's like open source, commons, and sort of ecosystem centric with a little bit of a blockchain bent, though not a fully blockchain bent. Just that's a commonality of a lot of the people running it. It's a third one by the organizers, and it is pretty well interlinked with the sort of we'll call sort of industry and government in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands. And as it happens that I know the organizers and the track organizers for Nature 2.0, Nature 2.0 being pretty open-ended, but it's about building things that help us have more biomimetic systems and like fair, more open, more common systems. And they were like, hey, like we really want you to bring a team. And I was like, I don't have it. Like I have a team, kind of like my team, but they're working on stuff. I can't just route them all. And then they were kind of pushing on me. And finally it dawned on me that like SourceCred was a super good fit for this. And so I super last minute said to Dandelion, like, hey, like if we could do this, would you want to try to like put together a team? And so we started both kind of hesitant about it because obviously I was sort of stalling anyway. And then well, we decided to go for it. I put in an application. It got accepted because they were asking me to apply. But we did kind of, I don't want to say like, this is being recorded, but like we definitely put in the names of the people that were like on my team. And like we included William, even though we didn't know if William was going to be able to come. And I told them that we were going to sort of have to potentially shuffle, that we have a pool of resources that are broader, and obviously, you know, brought the idea up to see if Brian wants to go. So as of right now, obviously Dandelion and myself are going. I'm working through my team members to see who wants to and who can come and who would make sense. And obviously we're trying to figure out the right mix of team members. But the idea would be to take a really strong hack at implementing a multi-class variation of the PageRank algorithm based on some of the designs that we've been discussing. In the meantime, ideally, this is in April. So in the meantime, ideally, we would have gotten some of the infrastructure set up and some of the testing and the graph models. And so that during the hack, we would have the tools that we needed to basically go full tilt at making something really cool, getting the Python prototype working, and depending on the time scale and the team that we have, potentially even getting the sort of production version of it written and being able to do a, here's what would happen if SourceCred ran on this. I don't think we're going to be at the level of saying, ta-da, SourceCred runs on this, but I do think that we could do a pretty cool like algorithm design and development and validation, ta-da, hopefully with at least one strong data viz team member so that we can present to the hackathon something that's impressive, even though the work is mostly AI. You're muted.
Even though the work is mostly AI, what does AI mean in this context?
I'm muted now. I say mostly AI in the sense that it's math and algorithms and not like the thing is like if we wired it into the production system, we could be like, ta-da, here's SourceCred. But I don't think that you necessarily want the end state to be to wire it into the production system if we're hacking on the PageRank algorithm. So you want to be able to do data viz so you can say, here's a visual way of explaining the properties of this thing that actually just has math properties. That's like what I find with hackathons. If you're doing algorithms and math, you need pretty pictures to make people understand why what you did is a thing.
Got it. Yeah, for what it's worth, I have a good history of making pretty pictures with data. Yeah, for what it's worth, I have a, it's not clear to me that the multi-class PageRank will be the thing we do at the hackathon. I'm open to it. I also feel like we might do that sooner. We might realize there's some really flashy thing we can do.
Something in the application though, so I was basically like I had to give them a discrete thing other than saying we're going to work on SourceCred because it's not like a come work on your project. It's come do a project. So I didn't overdo it because it was only a few sentences, but I basically said, hey, we're working on stuff and like we could do this project. Though to be clear, the team is fungible a little bit as long as we figure it out relatively quickly, and the exact scope of work is fungible as long as we go there and do something that we can highlight as distinct. We're not going to be able to just show up and say, hey, we hacked on SourceCred. So whatever it is that we box out, I'm pretty down with that. It may depend on what the team we end up with is.
Yeah, because kind of what if I were to imagine building something at a hackathon, what I would imagine is building the SourceCred UI for non-coders. So it's the thing where you're able to add in, like it's a thing that like other teams in the hackathon could have used, where just like every like discrete piece of work that you do, whether it's coding on something or whether it's like meeting with people or coming up with an idea, like the manual mode SourceCred, along with like a visualizer that lets you see all of the contributions like visually and how they interdepended, and then the like size of each visual thing is the amount of score that it got.
Right.
And I think that'd be pretty distinct from SourceCred's current scope. It'd be pretty self-contained, so it would like make sense to do in a hackathon as like its own prototype. And I think it would potentially resonate a little bit more than just SourceCred because it wouldn't be only accessible to coders.
Yep, no, that makes sense to me. I mean, the reality is that at this stage, the decision was mostly along the lines of what I would call intuitive alignment of the project goals with the hackathon's values.
Totally.
And then the fact that they were basically saying, please come do something. I actually have, I won't say other projects like that I'm on, but there's a bunch of people. There are at least 2 teams that are being sourced by the GiveF team that are related to design work that I've done. One of the hardest parts for me at hackathons, and it was actually the reason I didn't have a team to begin with, despite the fact that they did originally ask me a while ago. I'm a mathematician and a scientist, and I'm way more in the kinds of things that you show off at a hackathon and the kinds of things that I do are actually pretty disjoint. And so like there's like teams that are hacking on things that are based on work that I've been doing, and I have nothing to do with those teams because my work is, in the SourceCred sense, way downstream or way upstream of them. So like, I'm actually, even when I present it, I sent it and it said like, I had to fill the forms out. So I was the lead, but I was like, co-lead is, like I literally put that you were the co-lead, and basically so that when we get there, if you're like taking the reins of what we do, no one's like, hey, I thought we asked you to come lead a team to me. You know what I mean? So I set that precedent early so that there wouldn't be like, I don't know. I'm always worried about expectations because I care a lot about things. Whatever. You guys get the idea.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I think we'll go there, we'll hack on something, we'll have fun, we'll have something cool that we did. If we're working on, we'll come up with something cool if we work for a weekend. And at the end of the day, if it isn't exactly the thing that we said on the forum, it's not like they're going to kick us out.
They're not going to care. They're definitely not going to care. I just, like I said, I did a last minute administrative logistical, like, hey, we're going to do this. And so I had to make a bunch of last minute calls that were like, all right, well, I have to list people. So I listed some, mostly my own team members, so that they would say yes if someone said, hey, even though we're going to probably swap some of those slots out. And also I had to just describe something that if they came back and asked me about it, I would be able to answer, even if it's not what we end up doing in practice. It's in April. So what do I think, is it 12th through 14th?
Yeah.
Something like that? Yeah. So we got some time, and I think what's going on will help we'll have a sense, a week or two before what actually will make the most sense rather than now.
Yeah. So Brian, you want to come?
I would love to. I'm flattered that you asked me to come.
Cool. All right.
Brad.
I got to check in and find out ZX's status. I really, really want him to come. He and I were chatting about it a bit. His limitation is basically visa and school. So he's like trying to check his boxes, but as long as his boxes get checked, I think he'll come.
Cool.
Which gives us 2 spots to figure out from there.
Cool. So we have yeses from you and me, so that's 2. From Brian, so that's 3. ZX should make 4. Yeah. William, what is your thinking? You want to come hack with us in the Netherlands?
I probably won't come.
Cool.
But thank you for the invitation.
You shall be missed, William.
I will say that I would like to make sure that there's a spot reserved for, I'm figuring out which data scientist is going to be the big, I'm still figuring out who's going to be the biggest contributor in our collaborations. But as I sort that out, my intent is to make sure that that person gets a first shot at a spot. So, cool. So I'm going to hang on to one of them for a moment, but that still leaves one that we can sort of identify and invite somebody. I have some thoughts to reach out to, but I'm wanting to make sure that we're working on that together.
So I'd like to make a prosaic suggestion, which is that we should have at least one engineer who has experience successfully shipping code at hackathons.
That's a good point.
I think that, for example, my heuristics and my patterns around coding at this point have been honed by years of trying to write production software that will be easy to maintain in 6 months. And that's a very different set of constraints and time frames than a hackathon. So it'd be great if we have someone who just intuitively knows what kind of things to focus on to be able to succeed in that environment.
I'll probably then, if we suppose that that's the slot that we haven't accounted for yet, I can probably, instead of reaching out to my academic connections, that inclines me to go sort of bug some of my, I would probably call Griff and basically be like, hey, he put together multiple hack teams for this event, and he participates in a lot of hackathons, not necessarily as a, you know what I'm talking about? He's the GiveF founder. He's one of the... It's fine.
Familiar?
He'd probably be familiar if you ran into him, or if you it doesn't really matter. The point is that he's much more of a let's just say he's an off the grid type who basically lives through crypto and DAI. And while he was involved in stuff with the DAO, he's been around the block, but he goes to tons of hackathons, and in fact is sourcing staff for other teams at this event for projects that are related to stuff that I'm collaborating with him. So he's already been kind of diving into feeling out lots of people and whether they want to go to this event. And so I can kind of find out with him whether his sourcing stream has any essentially good people who are as yet unassigned, if that makes sense. You're muted again.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds good. Cool. So yeah, I imagine we'll have future conversations. We can have we can schedule a maybe like a weekly or bi-weekly like hackathon team meeting where we'll just like kind of sync up on where things are.
Yeah, I'm gonna start a spreadsheet probably after this call and just stick in the fact that we have us three, and then that we have a maybe, and then that we have 2 openings, one of which is tagged for a veteran and a contract, or excuse me, a hackathon veteran, and one which is at least tagged as me wanting to offer first precedence to the person who's working on SourceCred with block science.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool. So I think that's that item. Do you have any other agenda items?
Now it's open season. We got through everything on the agenda. William, Brian, anything you guys want to talk about?
I have some questions that might be more William directed, and they pertained to the sort of the production code stack, what it is, why it is what it is, and just basically I want to understand as much as I can about that from a architectural perspective. It doesn't need to be the fine-grained details, but I actually realized when I was making my notes that I don't know much about. I went through the code a little bit, but not enough to really understand the hows and whys of it. So
Sure. Are you asking for like an overview of the SourceCred technical architecture?
yes.
Okay. We did an existing video on this. So right, Dandelion, Brian?
We did a video
Yeah.
on an overview of the SourceCred technical architecture.
The first PageRank video has some detail on it, or your code walkthrough, I think.
Yeah, I do have a code walkthrough that has some
Okay.
context there.
So I'm sure we can find you a link for that. But in the meantime, I'm like,
We can elevate it a little above that too, because I think I'm less interested in it from the perspective of a developer and more from making sure that research stuff jives. So it's it's a high level question as opposed to a low level.
can you give me a question or two that you might want to be able to answer?
Sure. First question is sort of what is the what language are you doing the like mathematical manipulations in? So you're doing PageRank, so you're doing mathematical, sort of scientific coding. So far, the only thing I know about is the JavaScript, and I don't really think of that as a language. Maybe it can do more than I think for doing, even computing page ranking.
Right. Yeah, we're using JavaScript so far. If performance is what you're worried about, pure JavaScript tends to be faster than pure Python. Of course, you have like FFI from Python that you also have in Node, but not in the browser. So JavaScript has worked well for us so far. It also gives us the opportunity to use WebGL to have GPU accelerated things in the browser. And we wouldn't need to build all the core infrastructure there. TFJS, among other things, would suffice to provide that. Our current PageRank implementation is in JavaScript, and in fact, all of our code is currently in JavaScript, so I can just answer that one.
Question then about the PageRank implementation. Is it then the sum of random walks, so like iterative? Are you just iterating, or are you solving the matrix inverse? Because like
No. So we have a sparse Markov chain. It's a sparse representation because our graphs do tend to be very sparse, and we iterate matrix vector products sparsely.
And I'm assuming that they converge relatively fast then.
Yeah, so it's interesting. They converge. They used to not converge fast. We observed that we used to have the GitHub graph, which we still have, and also the Git graph, by which we mean that we pretty much embedded the Git object system directly into the source code graph, including the trees and like directory entries and things. And the nature of that graph is it's not far off like a long path graph. And so, it has some very long chains and occasionally some jumps, but not too much structure. And the inclusion of the Git graph caused the algorithm to converge very slowly. We removed the Git graph because we didn't think it was adding much useful signal. And also, like, there were some problems that we could get rid of by getting rid of it. And so now it converges much faster, yeah.
So what's interesting here, and this is something that you we'll probably end up having to explore on the research side is that how fast that converges is a property of the topology of the graph. It's a spectral property. And so like analyzing spectral properties of the graph is something that we can do sort of quote offline in research, but it will tell us something about what we can and should do in order to solve the sort of production version and have it be, essentially not get really slow. Like we might be able to, and there'll be sort of an outer loop on that, but that's sort of the reason why I was asking, because obviously we don't want to be doing massive matrix inverses. That's like never really a good idea. But
I mean, our graphs are easily at like tens of thousands of nodes, easily on small projects. So I don't think we want to be inverting those.
The question though becomes whether or not there's actually a lot of mixing in certain, basically whether there are like, what are most of the eigenvalues versus the worst one. So you're going to get things that converge, that seem to converge fast mostly, but then have lagging elements if you have the worst case slow eigenvalues. So I find myself curious about when we start doing spectral analysis of the graph and then kind of looping back to you and like having conversations about numerical methods that are like, obviously when you're writing them in JavaScript, the expectation is you're just going to be doing it's like straightforward numerical programming. You're not going to use any advanced methods. You're just going to do iterative multiplications, divisions, whatever you have to do. But we can hopefully, do in our research side some of the work necessary to figure out whether there are, say, alternatives that stay within the simple implementation regime that change the rates. So offhand, there are things like lazy random walks versus, there's ways that you can manipulate the matrices so that they have the same stationary vectors, but that they converge faster.
Yep.
And I think that jumps to mind as something that I don't want to prematurely optimize anything, but we can assume that if the implementation's in JavaScript and we get only this sort of, local addition and multiplication type of updates, that we're going to want to make sure we look at ways of improving the spectral properties while preserving the stationary vectors precisely so that the algorithm can actually converge faster.
That sounds great. Are just like off the top of my head, are these transformations that change the spectral properties and preserve the stationary distribution, do they tend to keep the matrix sparse?
Yeah, they're not generally affecting the matrix sparsity at all. You're starting with the constraint that you can only have a value where there's an edge. You're not filling in values for other edges. Usually you're either, actually the most common thing is to mess with the diagonal, right? To change, add or subtract a diagonal while retaining the positive semi-definiteness of the matrix. But the amount of self-weight can be manipulated and cause changes to the spectral properties.
Okay, it's not obvious to me that doesn't change the.
It doesn't automatically not change it. There are other. It's not a just tune this however you want, because if you change the spectral properties, you are generally also going to change the stationary distribution. You have to be able to change the eigenvalues without changing the eigenvectors.
Yep.
If you want to keep the same stationary distribution.
So I have looked into this briefly, not in great detail, not from a mathematical perspective, more of an implementation perspective before. And there was an issue on GitHub called something like PageRank convergence notes. I can link it to you if you want. And the one interesting thing that I found is consonant with what you said about certain parts of the graph lagging behind. If you just plot the loss function delta over time in log space, it's really interesting, piecewise linear. Once you can see the loss function we're using is maximum difference from previous iteration to this iteration in absolute value. And so once one part of the graph gets past a threshold, then you have a bottleneck in another part of the graph, and it just in log space, it really levels off pretty quickly. So
then there's two ways to analyze those kinds of things. One is through spectral properties, and the other is through things like min, cut, max, flow, and trying to extract the sort of information about the topology in terms of those kinds of bottlenecks. Although I'm not immediately clear to me that we gain anything other than just understanding of the current graph. So one of the challenges that you run into is that you can't actually fix this for the graph you have to fix this for graphs, which goes back to my point earlier in our call with David about actually characterizing the meta model for all valid graphs. And that's one of the things that that's actually the main focus for him with me, is that we think that once we've established the domain of graphs, like what does it mean to be a valid source cred graph, then we can actually ask questions about algorithms like what we're discussing now, and not have it be like, well, how do I fix the bottleneck in this graph? But rather, how do I accelerate the convergence in general for any valid graph, with the understanding that, you know, that means there's always going to be some slowest eigenvalue. The question is, have we changed the algorithm in such a way that it converges faster, sort of in the worst case? And I think that we'll have a lot of discussions downstream on this. I don't think that we need to push them, I mean, like in the future, I don't think we need to push them into priority soon. I just wanted to escalate the fact that this is, I think, something that's going to be part of our work. Like, it's just going to start with research and better understanding of the data, both the current graph and general graphs, and then come back around to whether there are specific variations in implementation that respect the sort of, like that, basically we're going to have this, there's going to be a dotted line between the implementation and the research that has to do with convergence rates. And so that's going to be one of the things that we care about with our algorithm choices. We aren't going to want to pick things that imply bad convergence.
Yep, totally.
And it's an area that was a pretty, I know that I brought this up a couple times, but a lot of this kind of work was the kind of work I did during my thesis, my PhD. So I have more thoughts than I can easily characterize. I can't just sort of dump a set of, here's what you need to know, but we can unpack it one problem at a time. So like when we hit a challenge, we go to address it, I'll be able to sort of hopefully hone us in on techniques and or references specific to the problem we have at hand, including convergence rates for these types of algorithms.
Sounds great.
Cool.
But we're not writing proofs. There's no way I'm writing convergence rate proofs like ever again. It was by far my least favorite part of my PhD. I spent 80% of my time just like battling a really, really obnoxious convergence rate proofs.
Yeah. I am happy to write combinatorial or like structural proofs, but I prefer not to write the analytical proofs, so I'm with you there.
Stability proofs and like convergence equilibria proofs I'm fine with. I actually very much like writing those, like proving properties. There's a lot of things that I'm very happy with, but taking an algorithm that you've already proven is got the intended fixed point, and then having to write a formal proof about how fast it converges is just like, just run it. See if it can, like, at some level, you're just like, figure out whether it works. If it works, use it. If it doesn't, don't. Like, don't spend 3 months trying to write a ridiculous convergence rate proof. Sorry. Anyway, like I said, spent a lot of time on that.
Duly noted.
That sounds like advice that is born out of like much grief and something that we would be wise to take into account. So noted.
Cool. So we're almost at the end of the hour. Any closing thoughts or issues? I would just like to thank Brian. Brian, thank you for making this office hours happen by just like scheduling it and putting a GitHub issue. I think having a GitHub issue for each office hours is definitely a great idea, because being able to just put stuff on the agenda over the course of the week is super helpful.
And then we can label them. I love labels.
Yeah, we can label them. Then there'll like be cred nodes for it. So yeah, Brian, if you're willing to continue being the office hours virtuoso,
It's no problem, yeah.
And I'll get this recording to you
For sure.
before too long.
Yeah, let me know if there's any like heavy lifting or anything you feel blocked by on the research end that you would like me to do.
Brian, are you comfortable with Python?
I've written like a Django application before, but not really. No, I'll probably have to learn it, especially if we're going to use it at this hackathon.
Yeah, we'll see what we should spend some more time thinking and scoping out the hackathon details, because I have a feeling that at the very least there'll be lots of JavaScript work to do on the hackathon.
Okay. Yeah. You should actually, if you want to carve something out for me to focus on to do, that would be helpful.
Like right now or in the hackathon?
For the hackathon, yeah. I don't want to show up and be useless.
There's a lot of
sure.
there'll be pre-planning. Once we nail down the team in the week or
Okay.
two prior, I think we'll do some pre-scoping so that we don't waste time at the hackathon trying to figure out what people are going to do. I also need to be babied a little bit because I don't write any JavaScript, so it's going to be like Dandelion probably trying to help us break the problem down such that we have beneficial things that fit our personal skill sets.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
If there's a mobile component, I could probably build a mobile app. I don't know if that's.
You know, that could actually be like, I do really like this idea of using the hackathon to prototype, like, you know, source code for the masses or source code for non-coders, or just like reuse the algorithm and like underlying philosophy, but make it something that people working on any kind of project could potentially engage with. And having some kind of mobile experience would be really helpful there, because I'm kind of imagining like, you know, it'd be like you can just open up your thing and you're signed in and you create a new node in the graph being like, I did this, or I saw someone do this. And then you like can draw edges between them being like, yep, this work that I did depended on that work that that person did. And then you get to like see the running like cred total based on this graph you're all working on.
Right.
Yeah.
Figure out how to throw that together might be challenging to do it
sure.
in the weekend. We'd have to think about it.
For sure.
Sounds good. Well, thank you guys. We
Yeah.
did it.
We did it. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and end the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.